Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is having his or her own coffee cup so that we can start. This is the third slot of our mini symposium named Learning from Others, where we will listen to three presentations, lectures about the experiences they had on the fields they were working on. Basically, they went through the same dilemmas that we are dealing with, and that we opened some of them yesterday. And when conceiving this symposium, we were thinking that it would be a little bit easier to reflect our situations through the experiences and through the eyes of other cases. So we invited three speakers that we know that had gone through the same way of thinking, reflecting, and then finally also resolving this challenge. We will start today with a first speaker, Ida Hirschenfelder. With testimonial and material evidence of her case. Just few words who Ida is. Ida Hirschenfelder was employed at the Museum of Contemporary Art Metelkova until 21 on the projects related to digital archives. She was editor of Web Museum, a repository for contemporary audiovisual art, and editor of Moderna Galeria homepage, where finally all these archives came into public space. To this day, she is a member of l'International Online editorial board and co-curator of the Glossary of Common Knowledge. Previously, she was an archivist of Devastation, about which Barbara Borčić will say more later on. And she also co-created Art Area, bi-weekly edition of Contemporary Art, and was an editor of feminist monthly sector Žive at an alternative radio station, Radio Student, which is our radio station by heart. She worked as a correspondent and critic at one of our main daily newspaper, Dnevnik. And amongst other media, she published text in Artwords magazine, Maska magazine, Digikult online magazine, Furtherfield online magazine, London, Dialogi magazine for culture and society, and in exhibition catalogs. To this day, she writes on media art, feminism, and archives. Please welcome Ida Hirschenfelder.
See everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's a really pleasure to be here. Thank you, Yuri, for the invitation, and also Micha for organizing the seminar. We've heard a lot yesterday about various dilemmas that you might have, and here I would like to maybe unpack some of the ideas that I was thinking of. I think I will not speak so concretely about the practical and very pragmatic questions and issues, but more of contextual thinking that one goes through when thinking about the archive. So first, maybe I'd like to give a little of the context. Yuri already mentioned that I worked at the Moderna Galeria, which is a part which also has two buildings. One is the Museum of Contemporary Art Metelkova, and I worked there until the summer 2021 on as Yuri mentioned, projects related to digital archives and mainly working on the repository web museum, of which you see some image here. The project deals with inventorization of artistic practices based on media technologies, from early video production to contemporary digital content and intangible productions. But most of the documents are connected to performance and discursive programs and artistic events and exhibitions and referential publications, which significantly contribute to the understanding of art materials and art that was produced. Through semantic connections, we draw attention to important segments of heritage that were not included in the semantic reviews of artistic production in Slovenia before that. An added value of the repository was to the creation of a common open source backend web-based interface for multiple users in an attempt to decentralize the archival process, whereby I, as a museum archivist, am not the sole gatekeeper of the archive. Still, the storage is not completely open, so that the archive doesn't turn into a tool or a platform for self-promotion of artistic practices, but still maintains some credibility of administrative archives. Organizations or individuals become the so-called users of the web museum, while the museum provides technical and content support to digitize, systematize, and publish the materials online when that was legally possible, and I'll mention that a little bit later. So this archive is ideally neither entirely open nor entirely closed, but a structure negotiated by its users who together have a better understanding of the needs that the art production creates. As Marta pointed out several times yesterday, with the question, what is in the artwork? With Rok, who is one of the constituents of the Web Museum, and also a user of Web Museum and a potential user as well, we are now thinking about how to better facilitate the inventorization of large photo collections or personal heritage that he will present later. The Web Museum was initially mainly intended for the audiovisual materials, and already facing with Rok's archive, we are faced with some structural insufficiencies. So the archive in ideal form is not only enough open and enough closed, but also on the move, not a static structure. This is, for example, a taxonomical insert that we already did with Rok several years ago, specifically to facilitate dance that was initially not supposed to be a part of the archive. And these are some of the users who are accessing the research, have the research access to these materials. One of the bigger and more significant archives in the Web Museum is Kapelica Gallery Archive. And so far we have digitized approximately 450 tapes containing around 700 audiovisual items, of which metadata inventory is made for about 200 documents from Kapelica production between 1996 to 2013. Most of the images I will use here are from this archive, and some have been a co-production with the City of Women Festival, which is also a part of the Web Museum repository. Most of these video documentations have unclear copyright contracts in regards to the publishing online, but they are available online on a request by a researcher for free. So anyone, we have that as a disclaimer on the webpage, anyone can contact whoever of the editors. Maybe it would be Yuri, or maybe it would be Rok, or the producers at City of Women, or whoever, or myself. And we would give them free access to view all the materials that are otherwise, with the disclaimer, locked because of the fear of infringement of copyright law. That means that the third party, and this is like a list of current third parties that are actively using the platform, is this open archival platform based beside the museum and the editors who are the users, we also facilitate the researchers, artists, university professors, curators, and others who are actively engaging with this materials. And maybe you will notice that a lot of these materials do not have a huge number of views so far, but this is only because it is mainly impossible for a regular user to view the materials, only if for the researchers that have special access. But also if someone wants higher resolution or full resolution video, they can always approach particular archives for whom we have digitized material and return it in physical form back to them, as we don't want to centralize the archive, but we want to keep the archive its own integrity and inseparability. And also, I think that would be sort of an act of colonization by the Central Museum if we would want to take the archive, but all we do is facilitate the digitation and activation and access to the material, and then return the archive to the original source. Of course, there is still a lot of work to be done, but we've made the first major effort to make these materials more accessible and available to curators and researchers. In this presentation, I will examine the archive in two mutually affected trajectories: the administrative and cultural, both followed by the challenge posed by contemporary art practices of the past few decades. First, I would like to make a brief distinction to follow the two trajectories. Whenever I will address a notion of administrative archives, I will use archives in plural, as there are many approaches and disciplinary differences between particular administrative archives. Whenever I will address an archive as a dispositive for thinking about structures of memory production, I will use the archive in a singular form. The administrative paper archives have undergone a digital turn, which declared the possibility of multi-temporal and contextual layers within memory technologies. But the administrative digital archives are still rooted in their technological and mathematical structure, which does enable a multi-temporal retrieval, but is still based on arborescent hierarchical architecture. For more than 2 decades, archivists, especially those who are informed by critical analysis of archive as an enlightenment tool to validate political or national power, they have been trying to propose a rhizomatic approach rather than hierarchical approach. But to apply this approach in a concrete administrative sense, we risk the structure to sustain a discursive bias. The administrative archives are, in the strict sense, a memory that promises an objective and non-discursive representation of singular time or event. One cannot simply take out archival records because they are, for example, politically incorrect. Precisely the non-discursive and non-narrative structure of the archives makes it such a powerful institution. These are at least, there are at least 3 concerns or doubts that I would like to point out here. The first has to do with some level of mistrust in technology. The second, with an understanding of time it takes to archive. And the third, with the sense that there is a lack of political will to enable such archives of memory production. Something that Yuri pointed out yesterday in the final discussion. Although digital archives are subject to general data protection regulation and copyright law, we must anticipate that images will escape control and the documents will be remixed, not following the original intention of their production. The digital archive not only stores documents and their meaning, but also affects their meaning with the structural environment in which they are situated. the digital archive has a certain autonomy which enables a montage of comparable perspective, yet performs certain, say, violence over the event and the body, which is based on the system. An infesting problem that we are facing in the administrative archives is a double lock between the long-term sustainability and accessibility of digital archives. It turned out that big data repositories are oddly, in some way, more vulnerable to time decay than physical objects, meaning that the programming languages and protocols that they are based on are deemed obsolete in a span of about 15 to 20 years. Many are now hopeful that the HTML5 will prevent such obsolescence, but I am personally less optimistic. It takes an enormous effort and lots of funding to facilitate updating and upgrading the digital archives. Also, with the artistic production, virtually each groundbreaking art production, we find that it doesn't fit into our firm and often rigid taxonomical structure. So there are always artworks that are somehow outside of the archive or incorrectly indexed, which produces untraceability and in existing retrieval queries. I'd like to give a short example. Honestly, I looked at this example about 2 years ago last, so I hope that something has changed by now. So in Slovenia, the academic credentials are collected by the National University Library. Whenever an academic needs to retrieve these credentials for an advance in academic position, they simply make a printout from the so-called COBIS repository of the library. And that works perfectly. And instantaneously for most academics, unless you are an artist, professor who works in anything to do with non-traditional formats that are not painting, sculpture, illustration, etc. The repository's taxonomy was created before the widespread emergence of this COBIS. The taxonomy of this COBIS was created before the widespread emergence of digital media in arts and has not been updated to facilitate such production because it would take just far too much money to restructure such a huge database like the National University Library. So when Slovenian artists apply for academic credentials, what they are left with is to give false information about their work to the archive. If digital systems and taxonomies become obsolete, that is even more true for the accessibility platforms. That means for the web pages through which we access these materials. This is the front page, the front end as we call it. They become obsolete even faster. And in the case of the Web Museum, I'm unfortunately realizing that the design update and the tools to access the material is crudely outdated just 8 years since it was first launched. And I think that this is some sort of a failure that I'd like to give you a pointer to, that once you have created an access point, there needs to be constant rethinking, restructuring, and updating must be a constitutive part of your work, not thinking that you will do one kind of work forever. I mean, for the long span of time, especially when dealing with the digital. It turned out that the promised big data analysis and cross-referencing research is somewhat also an intellectual fantasy if the tangible reality of the creation of the archives is not taken into consideration. By this, I mean to say that it depends on very pragmatic working conditions and workloads of the archivist. In our case, the museum had only myself employed for this, while the NGOs, who are the constituencies and users, co-creators of this archive, find themselves in even more stressed, underpaid, overworked situations. CARE, as a contested notion was already unpacked yesterday in Jona Zur's lecture. So care is a multidimensional matrix of power relations involving social and economical aspects. Care is never an innocent practice, but a conflictual relation linking living beings, spaces, and technologies. In our case, trapped by a precarity of culture of producers defined by politics that keeps culture in check. For example, to properly digitize, index, and archive just one short audiovisual document of, say, performance, it can take one archivist several hours, if not days, from start to finish. And if I would, as an archivist, attempt to dig deeper and do a broader documentation, this process can stretch over months or even years. The third trap of the archive that I'd like to point out here is the political will. I have been quite blindly, maybe I should come back. I have been quite blindly self-assured that working for a national institution is a guarantee for sustainability and long-term storage, preservation, and caring for the archive. Before that, I was working with Barbara, who will present later, in the video archives in the context of an NGO sector, and have experienced the uncertainty and at times also resilience of the more precarious conditions. I came to realize that the conditions in public and national institutions are much more volatile than I'd ever care to imagine. Recently, there was a change in directorship of the institution that houses the Web Museum, and they have not yet appointed an archivist for the repository, so no one is actually caring for the archive at the moment. Care is, as I mentioned, contested, conditioned by many factors, but when care is for whatever intention is missing, I can only think about neglect. So if I remind you back of the trajectories, now I'd like to go from the more administrative trajectory to a more cultural trajectory. In the cultural turn of the last decades, collective memory production has shifted its focus, on the one hand, to the analysis of technocultural temporal dynamics of administrative and social system, and on the other, to the extraordinary conceptual shifts posed by decolonial and queer cultural critique, calling for testimonial witnessing of minorities and the incorporation and the validity of indigenous knowledge into the archival production. The solution proposed so far is to enable transparency of processual, effective, and contextual aspects of lived experience, and as opposed to the opaque institutional selective activity. The archive thus becomes a testimonial rather than the material evidence. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, in her critique of post-colonial reasons, says, perhaps it is no more than to ask that the subtext of the palimpsestic narrative of imperialism be recognized as subjugated knowledge, a whole set of knowledges that have been disqualified and inadequate to their task, or insufficiently elaborated, naive knowledges located low down on the hierarchy beneath the required level of cognition or scientificity, end of quote. Indigenous scientists propose that their knowledge belongs to a high context, on the contrary, and relational worldview that includes all connections in interdependent dynamic balance in its consideration and activity. In contrast, Western science perceives the world from a low context, reducing context to a minimum with a focus of material objectivity, reproducibility, and productivity. Witnessing and storytelling is not collected and archived in an anthropological or ethnological sense from a lived experience into categorical apparatus of the existing Western archive. Here, I'd like to give an example of the importance of self-mediated practices of the Zapatista movement, who have for about 20 years made a conscious effort to create and archive their experience. Los Tercios Compas, the Zapatista media agency, promotes the mastering of technological tools and using them by the many members of the movement, as many members of the movement as possible, not just as their media strategy of validating their political struggle for self-government, but also as a tool for the reproduction of their own archival traces. In this way, the archivist is not a passive observer who collects documents that were produced outside of the archivist's work and outside, somehow in an objective world or in outside reality, but someone who actively engages in production of the archival material. The unfixed, non-categorical archives of performance art, of indigenous experience or living materials are therefore not something that needs to be done or incorporated into existing archives, but rather a lived experience that is performed through its production. And I understand performing archive in this way, in engaging of the production of the archive, much like Roki is doing a lot of times as well. I have had the privilege to work with the archives that were conscious of these processes, so that the artistic statements, witnessing, and testimony was already a part of their strategy of production. Here I'd like to show two examples. First, a bit of a tribute to Sunčica and Olga, who've curated the Break 21 festival entitled Dead or Alive in 2002. This piece of the archive was a little detective story and a kind of a thing that makes the archivist job worth doing and quite intriguing. In the audiovisual materials, I found mini DVs with just the inscription Break 21, nothing else. In the materials, I recognized performance works from personal memory, some from hearsay, some from direct experience, but at the time of the festival, I wasn't yet aware enough of being aware of the work like a curator, so I wasn't really paying attention to remembering the names and how the performances followed each other. The detective story started to unfold when Sandra and Jana from Campelica sent me a scan of a program that did not contain an artwork, which I was sure was shown on Break 21 by the late Marijan Crtalić. It took me some time to affirm that the program notes were printed before the last changes in the actual program were made. So the material archive is often less reliable than the testimony, and as you've all emphasized yesterday, it is utterly important to create documents as long as the witnesses are alive. Another example is more straightforward. It's a documentation of auto-inducer PH1 from 2008 of Andy Garci. That gives a detailed account of the content of the installation with the statement of the artist, a project description, and a 15-minute walk through the exhibition space in which we see very concretely. I'd like to maybe show one of this to show you a little bit of how these materials are placed here. So we have a very detailed account of the installation. So basically, there is, in this video, we have an overview of the entire installation, some description of the process, is not really the whole protocol. But I also believe that what I was saying before about the different disciplines of the archive, I think that all the archives complement each other in a way that besides the audiovisual archive that Web Museum is, we also have other protocols that are kept by Cappellica Gallery, and in the paper archive of Moderna Galleria, we also have others, for example, analysis in the newspaper or critiques or reviews, so that when a researcher approaches the archive, they cannot anticipate that they will find everything about one artwork just in one archive. One archive is usually just one piece of the puzzle. Before I continue, I'd like to make some statements that are not following a coherent story about making archives, but might give some inspiration of the consideration in their production. I've done this exercise a few times before, and it always changes a bit, all the statements. So the time is not outside of the archive, time is in the archive. The archives are keys to multidimensional universes. The living body is an archive of itself. The archive consists evidence. The archive is about interpretation. The archive will not save us from misconceptions. The archive is turned outward, looking inward. The archive should be guided by the logic of distribution, not the logic of accumulation. The archive is not a property or a location. This is from a performance piece that was, I'm only showing here a slide, but it's from a performance piece that was produced in collaboration between City of Women and Kapelica Gallery. It's the durational performance of Casil. They were melting the ice structure of a perfect body with their own perfected transgender body. Time is not outside of the archive. Time is in the archive. An archive is a time machine that actively creates ways of accessing individual or collective experience. Digital archives in particular, such as the Web Museum, anticipate open and free access to memories. They are not just representation of events, but a field in which we can surpass the informativity of events to strengthen our experience of the past and also the future possible worlds. Every idea of history is inextricably linked to a certain implicit experience of time conditioning our knowledge. The implicit category of time varies from culture to culture. The image of time conditions all experiences that we have, and no cultural shift is possible without changing this experience. The primary task of a social change is therefore not to change the world, but to change time. An archive is a tool for monitoring our experience and comprehension of time. It is a place where documents are given their story-making value as the consequence of them being put in the apparatus of time. And the apparatus of time in the Western experience is infected by the idea of linear historical progression and linear advancement that is ever better and ever faster. In this dromology, as Virillo calls it, our vision narrows, the context becomes blurred, and we are only able to perceive what lies ahead and not what contextual framework informs it. And the solution to that is not to go back to the pre-informational slow time, but to be open to the experience of non-linear time. If we want to fixate the schism in chronological time, it turns out that we cannot contain it. The now is always evading us. The question of nowness is doubly essential for the documents of performance and living processes. First, there is the question of the nounness of the moment of staging, the interpolation of the audience in a direct experience, and the construction of a performance subjectivity, as Amelia Jones would call it. And on the other hand, the document of performance is itself subject to its own temporality and repetition that is not actualization, not an iteration, but a new need and use that I define from the point of view of nounness. The incapability of nounness in the archive, libraries, and museums that accumulate time creates heterochrony, or time as a social and political category, not as an abstract physical dimension. In this sense, the archive acts as a time machine, configuring the chronological and visual images of society. We are not producing it to remember or understand the past, but to think about the future and the now, with new images of time that are neither linear, not cyclical, but in the constant now, in the movement. Temporality can cancel, neutralize, or turn around the dominant narrative of history, which is especially valuable when we consider the subjects carrying the burden of this history, such as minorities, sexual, bisexual orientation, health, or species. Wolfgang Ernst, in the publication Decolonial Archive, published and commissioned by La Internazionale Online, of which I'm a member of the editorial, thinks about an attempt to delineate the archive from historiographical production. He says that, quote, the notion of the archive has been extended from the symbolic order to the storage of signals, physical sound, and imagery. A memory has emerged which is capable of addressing human perception in a kind of repeatable hyperpresence. This does not only represent, but actually enacts different aggregations of the past, end of quote. For him, media archaeology is not just an auxiliary discipline to history, but an alternative model of producing data from the material archives of the past. While historical discourse strives for narrative coherence, the archaeological aesthetics deals with discrete serial strings of information. I think this way of using the archive was already performed by Foucault and the post-structuralist, but in terms of the production of administrative archives, we are still deeply rooted in taxonomical categories, not as different as we'd like to think from the 19th century nation-building archives. The old imperial conditions still define us. The historical archive considers the archive as the authority on producing knowledge, but the aesthetical one opens a space of individual remembering to artists. Such a division points to something unbearably comfortable and agreeable. While history can keep on producing social facts, art production makes effects. We can be content in discomfort if we agree to the archive as a means of affirming the existing knowledge and neglect that knowledge is not a fixed production. A way out of this position is not in insisting that the historical and the aesthetical position are separated. It also does not lie in the inclusion of personal remembering into the dominant knowledge, as I believe that the inclusion of, for example, oral history in the institutional archive would be would create that the latter would be create the idea that the oral history is somehow been centralized and colonized and prone to appropriation. I can find a way out of this safe position by beginning to think that the documents in the archives are treated with some sort of unease and unfamiliarity and being somewhat contested. Similar to the relation of the body to the machine shown in this artwork, for example, where I understand the body as an event and the machine as an archive of the categorical apparatus. This puts me in the uncomfortable stage of constant checking for meaning while the two simultaneously work with each other and against each other. In the reenactment, for example, The incapability of iteration of the iteration of subjectivity reveals itself as an impeccable repetition of the document, and this is somewhat controversial. Just like the machines, the archive is no threat, but an invitation to map new spaces and relations. National archives and personal archives can coexist not as complementary in the sense of stacking quantified evidence, but as different forms of the same thing in qualitative sense. From this perspective, the task of creating archive is not in mimicking certain archival form, but in expanding the concept of what an archive can become. This one I'd like to show, because it's really poetic. The archive is not a representation of events, but the field in which we can surpass the informativity of documents to strengthen our experience of the lived or unlived past, or perhaps develop a bodily experience different to that of the event, but in kinship to it. In this sense, the ephemeral art events, such as the beautiful 40-minute recording of Marta de Menezes hatching butterflies, continues its existence and participate in the production not just of meaning, but also of the life lived. I thought you might be delighted to see this document, and I don't know if you've seen it before. The archive is not a place where documents end, but the place where they begin. The archive is, when thinking of performance archives, and perhaps also archives of art that uses living materials, it is thus not the aim to reproduce the event or the body, reenacting it, but in the sense that, in that sense, like the collections are striving to display and reenact a certain kind of installation, for example, but rather that we make the use and creation of new experiences with relieving the archival material of its strict connectedness to the past, but that they become something in the now. In the understanding of performativity of the archive, I pay attention to how the archive is open outward and its capability of reflecting inward at the same time that allows for some measure of permeability. I would invite you to see this documentation in its own, like the whole 40 minutes. It would give you another kind of experience of what was not just knowing, but really like what was said up until now about caring and what it takes really to be in relation to the living organisms. And I think this is a really good example of how we can relive this action of care. Yeah, it's a pity now that I have to continue. For the next part, I chose an image from the City of Women archive, as I'd like to revisit a statement from before when I said that the archive should be guided by the logic of distribution, not the logic of accumulation. I must say that I really enjoyed Sunčica's provocation yesterday about the right to forget. About 10 years ago, I was thinking about the same question while being involved with Barbara in the production of SSA Digital Archive. And we were all about preserving digitation, categorization of data. And then I asked the wrong question, which was not following the tendency toward preserving memory in its entirety and forever. I asked how to enable dying instead of prolonging our digital zombie life to eternity. For sure, there are clear erasures like indigenous science that I pointed out before, which must not be neglected. Here I'm talking about another thing. I'm addressing the digital accumulation that happens not because of conscious decision to archive, but from automation of saving. Accumulation without purpose is not preventing us to find any reliable data at all. It's like a smokescreen for the ever-flowing data stream. The fundamental shift in this demise of forgetting and the prevalence of remembering too much of this data can have terrible consequences, not just in terms of privacy, but also in cultural sense. In psychology, the capability to suppress traumatic memories is a psychodynamic automatism that enables the traumatized person to remain at least somewhat functional. Likewise, the capacity of society to forget can prove to be beneficial. In observation of the very few living individuals with an unusual disorder that causes them to remember everything proved that they are unable to make any decision due to the surplus of the uncategorized memory, and that they are generally not being able to enjoy the present moment. If we look at this statement from today's schizoid post-truth reality, we may get some sense as to where society's paranoid frenzy and radical political polarization is stemming from. From the perspective of human brain, a computer that remembers everything is actually utterly mad. The brain has a system of ordering information before committing to a long-term memory. Victor Myers-Schoenberger, who was researching data accumulation, suggests that we would have to assign an expiration date for the information. That means that the producer of digital information decides on its lifespan. Keeping this in mind, the archive has an ever greater social and political obligation not to be an accumulation of things, but always keeping in mind the distribution of who and for whom and for what purpose it is going to be used. As Alan Sekula pointed out, for example, that the history of forensic photography and the criminalist archive is connected to the development of eugenics, the racial theories, and class discrimination based on evidence suggested by physical characteristics of individuals. So evidence is not a neutral ground. In the conclusion, I would like to show you a case where basically an artist becomes, in a way, a replacement. An artist's memory becomes a replacement for archives or canons of art. She remembered the names of 100 artists and wrote them out and produced a digital data stream that was outputted as a visual part, as another visual part of her action. And I think in this sense, she hacked the archive with her own body. I would like to now just for a second come back to the idea of the archivist as a gatekeeper who determines the procedures of historicization, such as the procedure of archive interpretation, valuation, verification, as well as exclusion, erasure, and separation. Archiving is always a selective process, and I pointed out to the danger of accumulation, but also there is a danger of omittance or overlooking, erasing. Reading the evidence is the only thing we can do, as the evidence cannot speak for itself. The same goes for seemingly ambiguous evidence. Reading is always subject to a cultural burdened interpretation. The only thing separating us from the completely arbitrary interpretation is then an ethical or personal responsibility that is limited by social and political interests or promoted by social and political interests, as shown in the work of Anna Chigon. So we might want to ask ourselves, what are the important selective decisions or criteria that we make and are subsequently consciously making, and we are constantly making to keep the archive alive? What are the reasons for framing the archive in terms of a specific art field, a particular genre, or a certain point in time? What sort of carriers are we handling? What kind of documents, photographs, audiovisual materials, protocols, correspondence? Here I would like to point out that there is as Rok might know, he has a large archive of correspondence that informs his research. And at the moment, we are paying very little attention to archiving our emails and correspondences from one perspective, because there is just too much of correspondence, but we are losing a large contextual evidence of the modes of our production. So the erasure of emails, the erasure of the human, the negotiable part of creating an artwork is something that we are not doing, and I think we should be paying more attention to. And at the end, I would like to ask how much of the archive is digital and how much analog, what kind of material evidence we keep, and what is presented online and how. If the archive is digital also and not online, how do we facilitate the access to it? And by this few questions, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Rok Vevar, who will present the temporary Slovenian dance archive and the approaches to archiving contemporary dance between detective, archaeological and forensic approaches. Let me present who Rok is. Rok Vevar is a writer on the theory and history of contemporary performing arts and a historian and archivist of contemporary dance. He is also the author of the book Deadline for the Show, Selected Criticism and Articles, that was published in 2011. And he's also very active as a director, choreographer, and he's also taking part in some performative artworks. In 2011, he founded the temporary Slovenian dance archive in his apartment and has presented it in Zagreb, Sofia, and Harvard University, Cambridge, USA. And in 2015, he hosted Actors of Eastern European Network, EPAP, students of the master program in choreography from the Institute for Applied Theatre Studies at the University of Gießen. And he's all in all very active in sharing his experiences to different performative communities. Between 2013 and 2015, he was habilitated as an assistant professor at the Department of Dramaturgy at our School for Performative Art, where he taught a seminar on theater, criticism and theories of contemporary dance. And he was also teaching at the Academy of Dance in Ljubljana, history of dance of the 20th century, dramaturgy of contemporary dances and analysis of contemporary dance. He's an active member of the Balkan Dance Network Nomad Dance Academy, where he initiated a project of regional archiving of choreographic practices in the Nomad Dance Institute program. So please welcome Rok to present his work.
First, I would like to thank Yuri for inviting me. And of course, Micha for all the correspondences and organizational things. Perhaps Yuri mentioned in 2011, I found it in my apartment, something that I call the temporary Slovenian dance archive. And then in 2017, I was invited by Ida and Zdenka Badovinac to move this archive in Museum of Contemporary Art Metelkova, and it is and it grew out of my private interest for contemporary dance and contemporary performing arts that somehow I grew up with in Ljubljana. I will, and this is the only, let's say, archive in Slovenia that deals with this part of non-institutional production. For me, it is a mixture of very personal interest and something that I think should be systemically provided somehow. Perhaps I can show you from the beginning that you will get a picture how it all somehow started. Here are some pictures from the archive at Zeloshka 125, where I have an apartment, and at a certain point, these things that I realized at a certain point that I have an archive at home, so that this collection of things that I started to, as Ida would put it, to accumulate, that this might be an archive, and that perhaps because I got the opportunity, or I got basically from my family apartment, which is the kind of bingo in the social, let's say, in the generational social circumstances and economic circumstances, I thought that I could give something back in return. So I opened this archive in my apartment also for the public. I gave some lectures when groups or individuals were interested to appear and use the materials. Then, of course, Ida appeared at one of these presentations, and this is how I got invited by the Museum of Contemporary Art Metelkova to have a residency for this archive there. And maybe, Ida was very helpful in this regard. To help me to. These are old pictures. Now it's a little bit different situation there, because recently I gained I got donated a lot of materials after the exhibition Performance and Politics in the 1990s in post-Yugoslavian region. What I decided that I would do today, that I would present and talk about, are something that it's not so connected to the technical aspect of archiving itself, but more I would give you. I selected like 3-4 examples of something that got very that's something that came into practice from the mid-70s on, and of course very much more frequently in the last 2 decades, which are reconstructions of dance pieces and certain kind of contradictions connected to it from the perspective of documents also that are used in this practices of trying to figure it out, what dance history with its absent object, which is usually performance, is or could be, or how it could be approached. While I was listening to, now suddenly the okay, I can see what was for me interesting when Ida was talking is the at a certain point she was mentioning the archiving and some kind of aspect of art of forgetting. I somehow tend to think that maybe really archiving is the practice of letting memory go, and what you do with this later on is somehow something that is a practice of recollecting, reconfiguring, or recombining things that contain time, but it's not, but maybe it's, and that contain time, but this practice is perhaps has to give up the intention, or has to give up of intention of this absolute recollection, reconstruction, or really tackling the kind of originality of time that that it is dealing with. Just I will show you. This is in 2017. We at the co-festival that I co-curate, we hosted, or we invited one performance that was premiered in 2008 or 2009. It was very popular and very. It basically toured a lot at a certain period of time, and it's something that Ecuadorian dancer Fabian Barba did. He was a student in parts in Brussels, but he came from the Ecuadorian context, and he was surprised how in Europe Ausdruckstanz or German expressionist dance is kind of totally absent. And because of the different Jewish or German migrations that came to Ecuador before and after the Second World War, the German expressionist dance was very present there, and he kind of understood it as his own tradition. And he was surprised that in Europe this is totally absent, so he decided for his final work in Parts Academy in Brussels to reconstruct an evening of Mary Wigman dances. What he did was very interesting. He did a whole research of not only particular dance pieces that he would do or restage, but he would reconstruct the whole theatrical procedure also from the social aspect of it from the 1920s. When we invited him, he would condition in which venue would be suitable for this performance, because contemporary architecture of theater wouldn't suit him very well. So he wanted to have an old-fashioned stage. He would do basically this collection or selection of dances that he would be able somehow to bring on stage it's a kind of dance concert form. It used to be a dance concert format, and he would do also, for example, he would reconstruct also the lighting, how it goes out, the piano that comes in during the break when the dancer has to change its costume. But he would also do, for example, he would print out the program papers for us in the typography that was used in the 1920s. And then, so we at a certain point in this evening of Mary Wigman dances found ourselves in the position where with this, let's say, historiographic or fictional positions in which we found ourselves in the 1920s. It was so kind of well done that we would be addressed as a historical spectatorship, which was very defamiliarizational kind of process of restaging this evening. And what was interesting, when we had an after talk and we were talking about basically the whole procedure and methodology of reconstructing this, he would say that basically from different contextual and textual documents, he would be able to reconstruct basically very well the whole evening. But there was one thing that he wouldn't be able to do, and this is something that is connected with this specific Ausdruckstanz practice, is that all dances were done with kind of subtext or subvocalization of dancer. So basically every movement that the dancers did was sub-vocalized with a certain kind of linguistic imagery, or which was the mixture of task or motivation, language behind the silent speech that would basically drive the movements. And at a certain point, when we asked him how he dealt with this missing part of documentation, he said that he was able to reconstruct some subtext for certain pieces, and then he basically just falsified the others. So he would do methodologically certain kind of substitute that would suit this, the principles that would drive the movements. So this is, yeah, it was also interesting. It is kind of interesting aspect of impossibility, really, to reconstruct or to. There is always something missing, and sometimes is missing a lot. But what was interesting, that he made the whole, let's say, study of cultural context in which these dances were presented, of a certain kind of dance paradigm that was practiced in Weimar Republic mostly, so in this example, this kind of, as I mentioned, this subtext is missing, and it's impossible to reconstruct it. The second example that I would do, it kind of is an example of dance practices, or the series of dance pieces that are based on subtext, or that are based on certain kind of description, or let's say scores, precise description of what these dance pieces should be. And these are Simone Forti's, something that in the beginning of the 60s she would call dance constructions. In 1960, 1961, she would do in Yoko Ono studio in New York and the Rubin Gallery series of pieces which she would call, in opposition to the term that was used usually in the choreography, dance composition, she would do dance construction. dance constructions. She would call these strange pieces dance constructions. Simone Forti was of Italian and Jewish origin, living in the United States. She was sculptor and choreographer. She would introduce some very interesting approaches to dance, and she would be one of the first who would present dance in galleries, not in theatrical situation. And in order for this, and she would be one of the, let's say, pioneers of something that was later called the postmodern dance in the United States, which is not postmodernistic choreography, but something that relates to the break with the modern dance institution in the United States. And what is interesting from the kind of documentation and archiving point of view, that there is no, she wouldn't claim the pieces as kind of, also they wouldn't have premiere. The premiere would be these plans, descriptions, short descriptions and sketches when dances would be related to the objects, in accordance with which the dance is supposed to be then done. What, in this sense, with this, let's say, documentation in origin, she tends to do is to avoid this instance or institution of choreographer watching from outside. So basically, everybody could do this in accordance with the description available. And of course, dance constructions in opposition to a composition would be pieces which would maintain the materiality of the body. So basically, the performed pieces would avoid any stylistic surface that would be present in the dance practices of modern dance at the time. And what is also in this sense of reconstructions interesting is that Simone Forti is now frequent in America and Europe. Mostly they would exhibit her works or objects that would be used for choreographies in gallery spaces and museums. And they would do in accordance with these scores and plans, descriptions, of course, reconstruction of the pieces. This is Slandboard. We did this also in Co-Festival 2012, some kind of falsified objects for the spectators to try out things on the object. This was the period when minimalism in the arts introduced object as something to be used in galleries, not only watched. And this is, for me, it's in opposition to Mary Wigman's case. For example, this Simone Forti's case is it contains kind of archiving or documentation practice in the origin of it, and it's much more, I would say, in terms of performing it, horizontal, let's say, or democratic in terms of using it, because it doesn't demand any trained bodies. What was also interesting concerning these original performances in the Rubin Gallery in the Yoko Ono studios in 1960 and 1961, when they asked Simone Forti whether she remembers any photographer that would take any pictures of this dance construction, she said that no, that she didn't invite anybody because she wouldn't consider these pieces to be in any sense important, or that she wouldn't think that this would last. So basically, there is, besides this description that she would do, nothing really connected to originality of the event itself. Now, perhaps. I wrote 2 years ago, it was published. It's a book, Xenia, the London Dance Years of Xenia Hribar, who used to be, who used to work in London at the period when contemporary dance was established in Great Britain in the 1960s, and later on she was the main force in this professionalization of contemporary dance in Slovenia in the 1980s. And I did a huge amount of research that lasted several years, because I did it in my free time in Great Britain, in order to get to the documents, and in order for me to be able to reconstruct or reimagine the period in which this British dance context basically was initiated under influence of American modern dance. And one case especially was interesting for me. I mean, I have to say that I had, in writing this book, no access to any film material, almost nothing. Some, but almost out of a huge amount of pieces in which Xenia Hribar, either as choreographer, either as dancer, performed, or which she made as a choreographer, which were 3 pieces. It was, in terms of documentation, almost no audiovisual materials available. So basically, what I had to is to interrogate the documents in order to get to a certain kind of picture what these dance pieces in which she performed and the company that she was a member of, what kind of work was done there. It's a huge amount of short and also longer pieces. And in their choreographer, Robert Cohen, in the early 70s, created a series of pieces, out of which, 2 were interesting for me because Xenia performed in them, but also because reading reviews of these pieces, it was obvious that the critics had a huge problem to understand what happened on the stage. So I had some photos, no recording materials, some printed things, some testimonies, memories, explanations of choreographer, and a series of reviews. These 2 pieces, one was called X from 1970, and the other one was called Mass from 1973. They are part of something that this choreographer, who used to be a member of Martha Graham Dance Company in America, Robert Cohen, came up with when he staged the performance called Cell in 1969, and he claimed that the performance somehow, the choreography almost happened to him and informed him that using everyday experience of the contemporary life back then is interesting for him and also for people who used to watch this, it's a kind of interesting remark, because it also shows how contemporary dance or ballet in London was distance from the everyday experience at the time. And he claimed that he was interested in choreographing bigger groups of people engaged in some kind of collective rituals, collective practices, let's say, from sport practices to religious practices to protesting, marching, protesting, to sports and so on. And so these pieces had no narration, but what was interesting, when I tried to reimagine what these pieces could be, was that all the critics realized that they were not watching the formal composition of dance on the stage, they were watching people doing things, dancing, let's say, but they couldn't tell what these pieces were about. And nowadays, for example, in contemporary dance, there is a certain kind of, let's say, aesthetic realm or tendencies that choreographies at a certain point, or that, let's say, choreographic composition inform you, or you realize that these are different kind of social procedures or configurations going on the stage, although they don't have any narration. And this is kind of, we know the pieces of Isabel Schad, Jefta van Dinter, I don't know. I mean, there are many of these kind of examples. I guess Pina Bausch was the first, let's say, choreographer one of the first choreographers who would get popular with this kind of approaches to dance. But these examples with X and Mass were very early, I would say. And it's interesting, when I was interrogating reviews and watching photos, it's basically the critics were guessing a lot what was present there, describing situations, but they were also very open that they cannot really tell, that they are without apparatus, that they are not able to say exactly, or that they are basically somehow lost. This was in this, let's say, kind of processes of reconstructing and trying to reimagine what was going on there. This was, for me, quite interesting situation. And then what was also for me interesting is that on the photos, that basically you have one picture in your mind, which is very kind of a reference to contemporary kind of work that you can reimagine from from the recent pieces, and on the basis of basically descriptions that you're dealing with. By choreographer and the critics. And then I saw photos, and I was kind of surprised how far my image is from what is basically present on the photos, because on the photos there is this, let's say, there is a certain kind of stylistic or technical aspect of dance that was very much present in the 1960s and 70s, very much informed by certain kind of American modern dance techniques, and which this kind of stylistic ornament, let's say, that would later be reduced in choreographic practices. So, for example, this is one example of, let's say, interrogating different kind of documents available to one when one tries to basically grab or imagine something that, let's say, are archival documents, and also to connect it to the a recent kind of production. Maybe for me, let's say, for me, in my process of archiving and dealing with the documents that or what Ida would refer to interpretation, let's say, and are using these materials, for me, I would say that in order to or somehow reimagine or reconfigure something from these documents, almost every document is, every kind of document could be valuable. When, for example, when a few years ago I was invited by the Slovene Theatre Institute, they would offer me that they would buy some documents from my archive, but they said they would select. I said that of course I have a collection, certain kind of collection in my archive, but I don't really own the material because I got these donations from different sources. And I said that for me, it's kind of very, very wrong to reduce the amount of different kind of documents connected to a, let's say, certain kind of piece, certain artist or certain period. For me, because I think in this dealing with this absent object, ephemeral practice, for me, everything around it is equally important. And also, I find that, for example, these practices of archiving contemporary dance is not exclusively connected to the particular art or pieces or dance pieces, but it's a container of different contextual information that may be at a certain point even more interesting than a certain practice itself. For me, for example, it's interesting also because as I consider dance work in the very broad sense, not only connected to these particular pieces that, or art pieces, dance pieces, for me it's interesting the whole situation that produces or enables these works to enable these works to appear at a certain point. This also with this book on Ksenia Hribar, I try to somehow try to enter with the rereading of documents the whole context that generated, produced, or created this phenomena of contemporary dance in Britain, along with different reasons that are connected to it. For me, this is like equally important or equally interesting. For example, you realize at a certain point that a huge amount of different aspects can appear in rereading documents that are maybe connected to the, I don't know, approach to labor in the certain period. It approach to labor in the certain historic period, and so on. So so I try to be, and yeah, I was thinking when Ida was speaking, talking about, I think, showing the example of Silvia Federici, and this, and you mentioned something with the art of forgetting. Yeah, I think for me, archiving is, to a certain extent, the possibility of letting go or forgetting in order to in the face of interpretation of or doing something with it, to be able to reconfigure something, reimagine something. And I think for me, from my experience, all these different documents and spaces between them, or something that opens between them, contain time, traces of time. And and sometimes things appear that you are not perhaps expecting. So for example, when I mentioned the, dense work, that it's not barely a dense piece or the stage piece itself. So what is, for example, in order to be able to get to some idea about a particular dense piece, I think the whole range of what dense work at one point has to be somehow taken into consideration. From, I don't know, training, studio practices that at a certain point became also pieces itself, of course, stage works with notations or not, discourses connected to this, kinetic system and techniques. Then, of course, what I want to, for example, what I am very persistent to keep is also all the documentation or with the certain artists that I have an access to, all the documents connected to production. For me, this is also very valuable document, or very valuable category of documents. It's very interesting to see how much artists were paid at a certain point, how things were organized, what they did by themselves, and what was, for example, provided by either institution or organizations. It's the whole, let's say, the whole mode of how dance is produced also at a certain point, and what kind of currency it had. For me, this is also a very important thing. It says a lot about how artists were able to live at the, So what, and also perhaps one aspect of the work that I do, or for example, while writing this particular book, it's all this, what I mentioned, for example, from production to the creative processes, it's basically contextual aspect of it. It's, for me, it's very important in order to a certain point to be able at all to get in the proximity to the work itself. I don't think, for example, in contemporary dance, that in contemporary dance is in any way possible to understand anything of the work if the contextual data is missing. And it's a lot of let's say, contextual or intertextual interrogation in order to get any information about the, let's say, stage work itself. I don't know. Thank you.
This brings us to our next speaker, Barbara Borčić. Barbara will present Devastation, the archive of video and new media art in Slovenia, which is for me one huge effort, and as far as I know, one of the first attempts to establish an archive of new practice. And I saw it as almost as an heroic act of doing that, because somehow being in this frenzy of changing storage media, we almost thought that we have to give up to all these different formats, like this kind of tapes, another kind of tapes, then diskettes, and so on. This just we understood it as a simple development of technologies, and we were tempted to let it go, but then through the efforts of Barbara, me myself actually reflected the situation, and I totally changed my understanding of how we have to deal with the not archiving, but maybe just keeping documents alive. Also the context about which Rok was talking. So we were like keeping all the invitations, and at that time where we were still sending fax. I don't know if you know this technology, but yeah. They are in our storage, and some of them are so full of interesting informations that I'm reading them almost as artworks themselves. But okay, this is not about me, it's about Barbara. And let me present her briefly. Barbara Borčić is an art historian and media theorist, but also a curator, director of Center for Contemporary Arts Ljubljana from 2000 until 2015. She was the head of video programs at Devastation from 2005 until 2019. She's active as a curator, lecturer, and publicist. She has curated media exhibitions, and I have here like 40 or even more exhibitions that I won't read, but I'm really looking forward to hear the expertise behind this Diva archive, that it's for the Slovenian new media scene like super important. So please welcome Barbara.
Good morning. Hello. Thank you, Yuri. He's somewhere, for introducing me in that way. I didn't know that was somehow such an influence, but maybe in the context of all the other issues about video documentation or something of live events or projects dealing with life, objects. Video seems like a simple assignment. It seems like one-to-one relation. But actually what we somehow learned is that it is always a question and a process of encoding and decoding in this kind of communicational situation. But it's also dealing with the material that, yes, it is on different carriers, like Yuri mentioned, the technology that is changing all the time. So it's also the question, how can you see the work in a kind of original, let us say, situation? So how can you see, for example, the tapes that were made mostly, I would say, in the 80s in Slovenia, in this particular situation, so watch them from the a tape recorder or a player, or even harder to watch pneumatic or beta. So it is the question, how do you define this archive? It's actually, we say that the material that is on the archive is actually the information. It's not the work itself. It's information. You get the information, and maybe you can get also some contextual information which helps you again with. So what I have to mention is that today Devastation is run by Petar Cerovšek, and he is also filmmaker, experimental filmmaker. So the focus of Arc-hive is slowly going also to the experimental film. And it's also because now the kind of demarcation line between film and video is fading out. So now we don't have the carrier, for example, that would, as it did, define what is video. When we made the first project, video document, selecting video works, we said that the final carrier defines that this is video, even though maybe it was shooted on 16 millimeter or 80 millimeter film. But nowadays there are no carriers anymore, so you have digital files, and film production and video production come very, very close. So we were also questioning, the relationship within film and video in one project, and also the relation between performance art and video art. So this would be a kind of context. I can say that Devastation Archive's role is based on the positioning of the archive as a strategy for writing narrative of video, mostly video, but then also some documentation of new media art and film now, as I mentioned. So it was the first strive to document first, to collect, and of course it's also the question and process of selection and exclusion. And I would say that the archive is, by definition, maybe always incomplete. So it is fragmentary, and it is at the same time also a reduction or even counter-archive. So we don't, I would say, we, like all the collaborators, many collaborators, and a very important was Ida. She was the motor for this online diva, of course. So I will maybe present a little bit of diva, but I would like to begin maybe with the story of becoming and then later of making. So this is just our presentation, how it all began. But first I would like to say that it was again, like Rock said, it was again my very personal engagement in connection with my formative years in the 80s within this alternative, so-called alternative scene, alternative culture, or even subculture in Ljubljana especially. I was also one of the artistic directors at Škuc Gallery at that time. So I had to deal a lot with organizing, maybe also curating, which was not the expression used at that time, of the exhibitions, but also of screenings and video presentation. Video had a very important role in that period. It was a tool of documentation, so that's why we have a lot of documentation from the 80s, I would say much more than from the 90s. And it was also used for programming, for programs in clubs or in gallery. And simultaneously, it was very important that it had this kind of social function. It was a strong means of interpellation of the community, so it formed a kind of scene. And of course, as an art historian, I was also writing about video art and also performance art. But at the same time, I had this, I don't know, it's a kind of personal feature that I was collecting. So I was collecting a lot, all these invitation cards or small catalogs or leaflets or information in the media and so on about not maybe only about video, but also about video arts. Then I would say that it came to a kind of serendipity situation, a very happy coincidence that I was invited to the newly established Soros Center for Contemporary Arts in Ljubljana in '93 to become one of the, I was actually the assistant director and later director. So that was the context that made the possibility to be really professionally, I would say, involved in research and documentation of video art. So it was not only financial side that was important, but also institutional background and international dimension. So what I meant with serendipity was, of course, that I came to the position that I could do something with what I was trying to do even before, out of this kind of institutional framework. So at that time, also local organizations approached me, or SECA, with some proposals. On one side, they wanted to make a kind of overview, curated selection of videos to be shown around the world, because the interest, in the 90s for the artistic production in this area was quite strong. So the other thing was that a video which was made in the 80s needed some kind of not only documentation, but also kind of care in preservation and archiving. So that was when this so-called Schutz Forum video production, very important that I mentioned in the 80s, was made possible also with the help of Soros Center for Contemporary Arts. And what we later on did were some programs which we called video spotting, and also documentation which we called video document. So that was when the narrative of video protagonists and media development in Slovenia was set. But that was the beginning, I would say. Later on, the Soros Center for Contemporary Arts, which was part of Open Society Institute, George Soros and so on, if you know of that, they closed the office in Slovenia in 2000. So we had the possibility to become a part of some larger institution like museum, but there were no real interest in that. So we established a small NGO. So that was then our way from video document on, was actually a small organization, but really on one way focused on work with video art or video production, which we used in the 80s, to avoid this kind of quality selection, or I would say with art. So we had many programs at the beginning. So nowadays we have only two, which is on one side is orientation on video, working with video, especially not only archiving, but also what is the function, what is the meaning and the function, how can it be used, and so on. So what I'm going to show today, I think it's mainly this usage. And on one side, I will show how the artist who was interested in our archive made a visit in the archive, and out of it made a project. And the other situation is when the archive, Diva Station Archive, made a visit in Gallery Schutz to present it to the public as a kind of open archive. What can you do with the archive? How can it be used, and how you can present it? So what was also very important for us was that we were able to be the partners in two international or European projects. One was Gateway to Archives of Media Art, which gave us the opportunity to collaborate with organization of good practices, as we say, and high knowledge. And of course, bigger organizations such as Montevideo in Amsterdam, Argos in Brussels, C3 in Budapest, even Ars Electronica and ZKM in Karlsruhe. So what we gained with that was not only that we got the budget for developing online archive, but also we could get a lot of knowledge and a lot of experiences from these partners. And another thing was, I think at that time very important, that we synchronized categories and the whole structure of the archive, and also the keywords and so on. So what it was important that international users would come to this gamma as a kind of umbrella, and then for the material itself, they should go to individual archives, But of course, through keywords, through other searches, they would come to our archive more often and easier than just to our individual. What is the problem, of course, with the archives is like that. You get the budget for evolving it, making it, but then it stopped. So this gamma, for example, stopped functioning, and that is something, again, what Ida mentioned. It is a very unstable situation. I would say also with Diva, it's unstable. It is still more or less on the level, as in the beginning with me, on the level of personal involvement, because we don't have any good circumstances, especially, but not only these last 2 years, but it's not that, for example, what would be maybe logical, that this kind of archive that is made on the broader maybe, but national context. So it is a kind of national project, would not be so dependent on how a small NGO is capable of working. So maybe should go to a kind of more stable level, but we don't know which would that be. And then the second EU project that we entered in, we're happy to enter, was a project dealing more with women artists, like it was called Not Yet Written Stories, Women Artists Archives Online, which is also now a kind of platform for getting some information about the artists in Slovenia. So what you see is actually what I will later on show you. It's from the exhibition, or from, I would say, a visit of Arc-hive Devastation in Škuc Gallery. And it was made like that you would enter into the context. So this was the context of the archive. At that time, still online Diva was not really finished, not properly. But you have projects that SECA Ljubljana was making before, and that were actually leading towards Diva archive. So I will go very quickly, hopefully, through this. So this is the organization, and as I mentioned, we have now two major directions. One is the School for Curatorial Practices and Critical Writing, also something that we did as a pioneering kind of program that is still the only program in Slovenia, and one of the rare in the region, I would say. And then the other is Devastation. And we, of course, we have two spaces. One is office, and the other is project room, we call it, where we make events, exhibitions, lectures, discussions, we do also publication, or we did, I would say, publication. We have library, and we have a kind of mediatheque there. It's also a classroom, so it's all mixed, but sometimes for the artists it's very interesting to enter our space, which is, because it's semi-public, it's a kind of working space, and at the same time it's with library, and you have the archive. You can use all that situation for your projects. Okay, so this is Devastation. I think I somehow already said that it is also in a physical space, but it's also online archive. And what we also do is a kind of research and curated programs, and they are interconnected. So the research is also when we invite good practices, I would say, to explain how do they do their archive, whether the artist, archive, or organization. So this was the start, video document, that was already mentioned, and it was really the first systemic research of video art. And it was in 1990 published, and it was one of the first CD-ROM. And then later in 2001, we also made the web page, which you can still access. This is how it looks. So it was, the focus was on the artists. We, of course, selected, again, 21 artists who were at that moment when we did it, those who made a little bit more than 1 or 2 videos. So they were from different periods, so I would say from the beginning of 70s till that day. And if you enter the artist, then you get more information. Important for us was also to do chronology, which meant that you would get a kind of context which defined how video was made or used, or how it, what kind of infrastructure was at that time, events and so on. Because, for example, in the 80s, there was a very important for video, but also maybe for the arts, contemporary arts, was the biennial called video SD, because it was in Cankarjev Dom in Ljubljana, and it was from 83 till the end of 80s. It was very important because what we could get was not only see the works by international artists, but also communicate with them. And important was also that this biennial was very unique and also popular, because there was also the possibility to produce the work. What was not so fine was that the director, Miha Vipotnik, the video artist himself, he was trying to develop from these festivals and the possibilities of production also a kind of open studio, video studio, which he could never achieve that because there was no interest on the institutional level, I would say, how to deal with that. So this is then how we try to disseminate, not disseminate the knowledge, and maybe also with programs, with screenings, the works themselves around the world. But we were at that time hosted by many organizations also in the former Soviet countries, which was very important for us because we had no knowledge about the art scene there and so on. So there were very good opportunities to travel and to disseminate. So we are not distribution kind of organization, but we don't have rights for works. What we make is we sign agreement, not a contract, with the artists that we can use their works. But then there are different levels, and they can select. So maybe they don't want to have their video incomplete, but only a trailer online or so on. But we also say that if we make an agreement, it is like we have their work in our physical space, digitized, and we can use them for this kind of programs that we do. We always let them know about, the idea to make one program, because we are also inviting people, curators or students or researchers, to do the programs out of the archive. And this is one of important usages of the archive. Then what we also try to continue from this gateway to archives of media art was to stay in contact with artists and institutions of these so-called good cases. And so we hosted a lot of artists who actually were dealing themselves with their own, or not necessarily only their own practices, video practices, how they pack this kind of interest in documenting and archiving. And of course, all these organizations gave a kind of information about how you can do that. What was also important was that we tried to make a kind of overview of what the situation about the archives, again, artists or organizations is. So in 2005, actually, together with Gallery Kapelica, we did also the exhibition of these kind of formats that could be used for archiving. So from CD-ROM to websites, to DVDs, to raw material, to kind of narration made out of the documentation or archives. And maybe this project, archiving of multimedia art, we called it. So it was, as a NGO organization, we always say that we make actually kind of models, and we show how something could be made. And we were also interested in how to archive a performance or installation. We took 3 artists with 3 projects of them, and tried to actually stage or perform the archive. So this was, for example, one of the performance installation situation in our project room, which we wanted to archive. And I have to say that when listening yesterday to your lectures, I would say that archiving in this sense comes at least in 2 stages. So first, what we wanted to do was to collect all the documentation material from photo because maybe I should shortly explain what was that. The artist said that was discussing the pollution of art. So when you entered the situation, you had to decide whether to go left or right. So if you decided to go right, you got this glasses that you could not see then anything, but on this side you could see, but the screen was not showing anything on this side. It was not transparent. So the situation was that in any case, you couldn't see the video, and still we don't have the access to knowing what was actually there. People who were sitting on this side, they said that they could see some, drops of color. But at the same time, there was audio. The artist herself was reading her text about pollution in art. And so this was a kind of ambiental situation with, of course, the receivers, very important. And what we did was to select all the material we had, to make a description, to list all the I would say, items that could be placed in a kind of archive of this. And we also had the text, audio, and also the text published in a magazine in Slovenian. So somehow the public could still be in a physical space and see, for example, physically or even touch something physically, what was used there. So it was a little bit more to the kind of experience, especially because it was the same space and so on. But then the second stage would be how to just make it kind of digital information, which we did, but of course it's then somehow ripped off any this kind of experiential situation. Then in our archive, of course, we got a lot of we have here high resolution works because online there are low resolutions, a little bit higher nowadays than before, and we have all this archival material we collected. But second important thing is that we sporadically get works by international artists, and of course we don't have the right to put them online or something, but we have them, and it's very important that we have also some archival project with DVDs of European media archives. So it's maybe still a kind of information office for video. So this is the situation. So you have on one side these carriers that we have, like we call it physical, maybe not the right expression, and then online archive, which we developed then later. And I will just briefly explain. This is what I meant with visit of Diva in Škuc Gallery. It was a temporary visit to show how the archive actually could be used, presented as live archive, and then used by public. So this is the first one that you already saw. So this was the beginning, and then this was a kind of the back room, which showed actually how the technology and also the equipment changed, and during this period, especially from analog to digital. So you have this black room in which also the events happened. So there were people working on analog technology at the television station, for example, in Slovenia, who came and collaborated with younger generation in digital, and they made some programming together. So this is how it looked, that people could see. This is the first one, is really rare. It's open reel from the 70s. And then you have all these other carriers that people could at least see. Huh? Because they were not empty, they were all connected to a particular artwork. this was how we tried to help the audience what to select. For example, by the name of the artist, by category like action, animation, documentaries, music clips, and so on. And we also had some VHS equipment so that they could see all what VHS was, what was specific for VHS. For example, all this kind of snow and so on, all the mistakes made from they could see them from that. We were also having our own kind of selection. Okay. So this is what Nika Graber, who made a video essay, we say, about this exhibition, and also trying to follow a little bit of making of the archive is. And I will show it then later. And now we come to online digital video archive. And of course, as I mentioned, there are this structure that was negotiated and with other organizations involved in this EU program, Gateway to Archives of Media Art. And so the database is what we try to do is, okay, description and artist bio or details of production, but try to give some context of the material. Then material is mostly art video, I would say, and then a little bit of film and new media documentation. But then there are also events and sources. You can search differently by artists' works and so on. So we will just look a little bit how it looks. It was made by architect or engineer, but also the artist Borut Savsky as a structure, and it is, as my younger colleagues mentioned, it's very old-fashioned, and they would like to upgrade it and so on, but, well, we have problems with finding some financial sources for that. So what you can see is how the structure, what are the main, how you can search. Then you can search by genres and years or decades, and so also you can make your own kind of choice. Somehow the program gives you some similar works always, so can try to put you in a bit wider context about that. So I will show you now, well, it is as it is in this online. What I mentioned as a visit of the artist in the in the archive. Actually, I invited her to do some project in our space, but she decided to do that as a kind of performative situation in connection with our archive. So she spent physically in our archive quite a lot of time, but then also checking it online. So this is how she herself made a document of this. Actually, what she did was to select some works, and then she performed them. Yeah. Could I have some sound?
I love myself for who I am. I love myself for who I am. I love myself for who I am. Turn 45 degrees to the left. Go. What really happened? What is going on? Stop. Wow. Is this something special? Here it is. Here it is. Or I think it's a new project. So do you like sounds, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you can write something like this. This is really good. Dobrodošli, tebe dražbi. Lastnik določenega umetniškega dela bo postal tisti, ki ponuja najvišjo ceno za ločeno delo. Poglejmo. Delo številka 1. DVD dolžine 21 minut in 7 sekund. Ločljivo 720 x 576 pikslov. Format DVD PAL. Sklepna cena 50 evrov. Kdor ponudi več, bo seveda odnesel to prekrasno umetnino domov. Kot se gibljam v takem čudnem prostoru. Ja, take čudne stvari. Slovenke, nekako nisem so kaj prav posebnega naredile. Ne bi zdaj znala povedati, čakaj, Celje je bila ena pol moški, pol ženska, kaj že bila.
How it looks in our project room, which can be used in very different ways. And I will finish now with this video essay that is maybe more explaining how it, showing more than explaining how the process was going on in preparation of exhibition, what was happening at the exhibition, but also she is architect and she is following also this question of memory that was mentioned quite a lot in this symposium.
Kot je misel ujeta v telo, je telo ujeto v prostor. In če poskusimo razbiti plasti spomina, ki jih je ustvaril čas, se izkaže, da telo naseljuje le gib med obema poloma. Prostor prehaja v misel in misel se prikrade v prostor ujeta med signale, kable, svetlobo in senco. Pred nami se zariše kot iluzija prostora, ki izbriše realnost ter nas postavi v čas spomina misli. In kot video spreminja čas, v katerega prostor se prikrade, se s časom spreminja tudi njegova podoba.
Video se v bistvu zelo spremenil. V bistvu sam način produkcije, recimo avtorskega videa, se je blazno spremenil. V začetkih, se pravi v 70-ih letih, je bilo to predvsem stvar televizije, ker nihče od civilov, če se tako izrazim, ni imel dosti dobre opreme, da bi se lahko produciral karkoli takšnega. V 80-ih se je stvar že malo pluralizirala, recimo, ampak še vedno v 80-ih je bila zelo, tako kot v 70-ih, v 80-ih je bil pomemben eksperiment, sama formalna slika, sama formalna podoba videa. Potem recimo v 90-ih, sploh pa zdaj v tem času, se je zadeva spremenila do te mere, da je ta tehnologija dostopna skoraj vsakemu.
Zdaj živimo v času, ki omogoča slehrnemu posamezniku, da se pač posluša tega pač medija. To dejansko pač prinaša pozitivne stvari, po drugi strani pač tudi prinaša te probleme, ki jih pa načeloma prinaša tudi celoten internet. Se pravi, poplava informacij, poplava nepreverjenih informacij in pač ta neka racionalizacija se mi zdi, da se dogaja na vseh nivojih.
Mi živimo v enem času take zelo slabe resolucije. Se pravi, vse, kar vidimo, ponavadi je v bistvu že tukaj zreducirano na neko golo informacijo, pač low resolution, kot je, ne vem, YouTube, karkoli, ali diva. In meni se zdi, iz tega lahko znamo, smo že tukaj se naučili, da lahko znamo iz tega prebrati, kaj je za tem.
Pri tem pa se ni spremenila le podoba videa, temveč je nasičenost časa s podobami, ki iščejo pozornost, pričela spreminjati dojemanje realnosti prostora.
when you just go back to the history 20, 30 years ago, you could say you had on the one side art and on the other reality. And then you had all those developments called expanded architecture, expanded theater, expanded cinema, expanded painting, expanded sculpture, whatever. Means they tried to approach to reality, knowing they're on the one side and they have, in a way, to identify the one with the other. Now you could say there is already this symbiosis of the both of them. There is no difference anymore, and we have to turn it around to bring back an awareness that media are still just media. That's what I'm saying. I guess in a way we forgot that this kind of ideological charging of reality is based on media.
What is your opinion about putting your work, for example, on YouTube?
Well, 20 years ago, that was our dream, in a sense, because we were being distributed on cable television on the public access system in the United States, which was limited, although we reached certain audiences because we had New York and San Francisco and LA, some of the biggest cities. But still, the dream of just widespread access, as big as any TV network, was what we were looking forward to.
Prostor nizke resolucije je misel soočil z dejstvom, da se mora orientirati ne le znotraj 4 dimenzij, temveč tudi znotraj računalniškega spomina.
I would say every person nowadays is a curator, so there are no curators anymore. Even curators are ideological construction. Potentially every person using the web is potentially a curator. And whenever you look for something, you find something, you put it together, you make a series out of it, you're already curating something. But the question is, what is the meaning of that? How does it enable you to create a political, a cultural statement? How do you respond to which notion of the public? Where is the side to address someone?
Žive je pač nastala po enih drugih projektih, ki so se z videom ukvarjali, to pač na STC Ljubljana. Vsi ti projekti so tu zdaj recimo z logotipi predstavljeni in jaz sem sodeloval z STC Ljubljana prav pri teh prejšnjih projektih in pri zasnovi te Žive. Ljudje, ki pač se s tem portalom ukvarjajo in sodelujejo z njim, so pač strokovnjaki z tega področja. Umetnostni zgodovinari, umetniki in te ljudje pač tvorijo neko kritično maso, ki pač definira te videe kot pomembne.
In kaj to pomeni za podobe, ki jih uvrščamo v polje video umetnosti? Ali so v času, ko so zamenjale gostitelja, produkcijske hiše z internetom, izgubile bitko za prepoznaven prostor, še preden so ga naselile, oziroma kako je nastal digitalni video arhiv?
Mi smo imeli leta 2005 v Kapelci prvo razstavo, kjer so bili arhivi, kakor smo jih lahko razumeli. Ali so bili CD-romi, ki jih organizacije naredijo, ali so bili umetniški projekti, ali so bili na DVD posneti, ali je bilo neki spletni projekt. Potem čez 2 leti, 2007, smo naredili razstavo Kaj se dogaja, ker smo rekli, zdaj že vemo, kaj storiti, ampak kaj se dogaja z audiovizualnimi arhivi sodobne umetnosti. In takrat smo imeli razstavo v bistvu spet v Kapelci in smo takrat povabili že te naše partnerje iz projekta Gama.
Gama, Gateway to the Archives of Media Art, je osrednji portal, ki povezuje evropske digitalne arhive video umetnosti v prepoznavno celoto. Deloval naj bi kot vrata, skozi katera obiskovalci vstopajo v svet video umetnosti.
It's a question of representation. What to represent and how to make that clear. And with our surrounding of media, We could say it's like this feeling of a double life. So I have it once practically performing it, and at the same time in this kind of taped medialized version, you can say, it has this charm of a virtual existence. So whatever happens doesn't really happen because it's just happening in the realm of media. And this kind of non-reality associated with it is the interesting part.
Če ima resničnost virtualno dimenzijo ne le v spominu telesa, temveč tudi v računalniškem spominu, ali so spletni arhivi res našli način, da odpirajo prostor video umetnosti?
Današnje predavanje se bo malo ukvarjalo s tem vprašanjem, kakšna je bila obljuba arhivov, ki bodo tako dostopni, ne? Koliko je ta dostopnost resnična, ne? Ker tako, kot je bilo vprašanje zastavljeno, ker se zadeve kopičijo, jih je treba na en način urediti. Ne smeš jih pa spet preveč, moraš dopustiti, da je malo tega kreativnega kaosa v vsem skupaj, ne?
And I guess that's one of the chances we have with the archives, these collections, to say then to create a kind of a space that is not linked to territory in the classical sense, but related to a question of interest, of meaning.
Kako torej deluje diva? Kako lahko odkrivamo podobe, ki jo naseljujejo? Kako so oblikovani kriteriji, po katerih jih lahko spoznavamo?
Zmeraj, ko narediš en kriterij, takoj se ti pokaže, da je tam eno delo, ki v ta kriterij sicer ne more čistko iti not, ampak da vsem ti želiš, ne? Torej, glavno vodilo je tako, kot je bil že pri videodokumentu, videoumetnost v slovenskem prostoru, to, da je to raba videa v kontekstu umetnosti.
Tisto, kar je tega teoretičnega dela, kar je v bistvu arhivskega dela, kar je Andreas rekel, da ni dovolj, da opremimo to samo z imenom avtorja, naslovom, trajanjem, letnico in tako dalje. Je pomembno tudi, da to delo nekako kontekstualiziramo in zato imamo različna orodja. Prvo in najbolj tako delu uslužno je to, da ga opišemo z nekim sestavkom oziroma sinopsisom, preko katerega je možno nekako ta okvir, v katerem je delo nastalo, razumeti. Potem ga pa opredelimo še z nekaterimi temi besedami oziroma z vrstmi, ki služijo kot neke krovne besede in niso vedno eksaktne ali pa uslužne delu, vendar omogočajo nekako navigacijo v samem sistemu oziroma navigacijo po tej mapi, s katero se soočamo.
It seems like with YouTube and the net, in some ways, one of the downsides is that there's so much work out there now that it's very difficult to establish publicity and distribution for smaller art, for smaller work. So it's out there, but how do you get people to know that it's out there? And it seems like this kind of project is really invaluable, and it could be a key for a lot of the individual artists who are just flooded with, you know, a million other videos out there on the web. That is, in some ways you're establishing a brand. And even though there's great variety within the archive, you're collecting them all under one name, which gives more attention to the project as a whole, and thus provides a way for people to kind of start concentrating on each individual piece.
Mislim, na ta način lahko pač priješ do enih informacij, do enih umetnikov, enih umetniških del, zato ker pač, kot sem prej že rekel, so v bistvu v nekem kontekstu, ne. To je sam začetek, ampak to je čist štart. Ja.
Če se prepustimo videu, nastavo jame v iluzijo prostora časa, pri čemer zabriše meje fizičnega prostora. Če so video podobe postale tako močan faktor pri ustvarjanju resničnosti, je zamisel premalo, da se je sposobna orientirati po fizičnem prostoru. In kaj to pomeni za čas?
What notion of time do we have in order to identify space becomes more important. And now we come back to the question of memory, in which memory was once related to a question of time, to say then memory has a temporal relation to presence. But with this, what you also said before, not again anymore in this historian sense, but to regard it just as a distinction in time, to say that memory is just another mode to think about the presence.
Spomin nastaja, ko telo iz prostora misli podobe. Tako spomina brez podob ni. So le fragmenti, ki se vračajo v kaos. In obratno, ni podob brez spomina. So le misli brez obstanka. Arhiviranje je pravzaprav ohranjanje nekega spomina. Diva išče spomin podobam, da bi lahko mislili prostor umetnosti, kajti brez tega smo ujeti v podobo sveta, ki nas mehanično poustvarja.
Let's start with performing performers. Now, performing lecturers. Three of you mentioned that were presenting us how the archives started, and that you all had a kind of privileged moments for setting up the archives. And right now, in our project, we are more or less in the same situation. We got this one shot to establish the archive, but now everything begins. And you all said that this is actually a political struggle, because you put something on the map, and if you don't, you are not existing. No? And everything is working against that. And all of you have your own experiences of how to sustain that. It's very personal engagement from all of you, while in our case, it's a group engagement, and we still don't have this one person. Or is this one person necessary? The spiritus movens that will take an overview or maybe stimulate others to contribute in caring for all these materials. So instead of going again through your experiences, I would ask how you would reflect on our position through your experiences, how you're seeing the situation through your own eyes.
yeah, I guess what I realized, for example, while working with colleagues from the region, because we are establishing now also the Balkan digital dance database, or we are in the process of establishing it. What I realized is that without motivation, things are always unclear in the process of establishing things. When there is motivation, it somehow suggests by the methodological work later, it's a little bit easier. I realized at a certain point that there is that people can kind of that they find very hard to understand anything concerning archiving if there is no will if there is no will kind of involved, really, like this kind of something that I would call personal motivation, but I don't like to think that this is kind of individual thing. For example, in my case, is a certain kind of, I would also say, contextual anomaly. Sorry. So, but what I would say from the experience of, for example, co-curating, co-festival, is that I think that the working in collective has to have a constant new inputs in order to kind of reconfigure, that it reconfigures motivation. Yeah, this is what I would...
It's also like the desire is, there can be collective desire, but desire is basically really an individual thing that can feed into a collective kind of impetus. But it's still the desire to make things visible that comes from an individual. However, I do agree that that's not a personal struggle, and it never was for neither of us. You would never have had what you have without the donations. I would never have had the knowledge without the hours and hours of communication when we were making Diva and later on, and I would never have had the idea how to make an archive in the institution where there was none if I wouldn't be informed by all the debates of these reconfigurations. So to come to an idea to open up an archive to other users but yourself, you are in the individual with the desire or with the motivation, the archive would never have been structured like that if it would be my personal endeavor. So it really, everyone chips in, everyone informs, and like what we did a couple of years ago with Web Museum with Rok, is we had to, at a certain point I came to a realization that I have to restructure everything and really destroy my architecture to be able to facilitate dance. And this is like some radical things that you do in negotiation. It cost us half a year of work, and sometimes you have to really admit it. I made a structural mistake, and now I have to repair it, and now I have to be resilient. And I think that resilience is something that Barbara can really relate to in terms of this question of personal engagement and collective engagement.
Well, I think, it's always kind of group work, but it's the same situation here. You are the person, and then there is a team. As I understand it, also the same. And it is based on the program that Kapelica had from the beginning, I would say, till now. So the difference between what we did and what you have to do with your partners, as I understand, is video art as a field was actually established in the 70s, more or less. Maybe in Slovenia it was not something really existing on a level of more, I would say, theoretical level or documentation level and so on. So we had to define the field somehow with our project. There are many collaborators, and you saw some of them in this essay. They have different perspectives of what it meant and why would that be important to do. So it was all a mixture of all of the people and their, I would say, opinions and statements and involvements. Of course, I think still it's somehow that one person is important because in my case, and I understand also in your work, it's that you have this, what Ida says, desire or wish to do that. Because maybe I missed to mention that I also did some video works in the 80s. So my connection to video was multiple, I would say. And when I became the director of Soros Center for Contemporary Arts, then I said, now we shall do that. So that was my, I would say, main role. But then how to do it was a lot of discussions, and also with the discussions as you have with your partners that we also had. We couldn't have made that without that.
Yeah, like time-wise, the situation is a little bit different now. No? We do have physical archives, as we saw. The spiritus movens in this project is Marta with his own collection, but we also, the other partners are producing it. So now we are meeting online, no? And it's a group work since the beginning. And probably you didn't convene a symposium where you decided how you will build up a Diva station or, I know, archiving or your museum. Ah, you did? Uh-huh, so.
Maybe not for video documents.
Uh-huh. Okay. Next question is like more visceral. I don't know who you mentioned in a way, but also you did. However, you are more political in how you all selected works that enter your archive. No, you structured it at the beginning. You said there is an administrative archive, and this is a cultural archive. And this administrative archive, I think it's a tactical decision. You know, you don't need to ask everyone for permission. I know, and you just avoid all this paperwork and so on. But then slowly the interest is growing, so this will to acknowledge your work is coming by its own. I know it's not coming, but it's much easier to give you the consent of using the material and so on. No? You did it by literally sacrificing your living space of doing that and your way of living in a way. No? Your approach was more institutional, but somebody mentioned that there is, in the way of making it, where you have to ask yourself who you will include and who will exclude. No? So I would like to hear more about this process, because it implies, as we heard yesterday, criteria, standards, and so on, but maybe not.
maybe I can pick it up. I think I was trying to get at that with the notion of accumulation, because at first I always had the desire to do everything, but as Barbara mentioned, this is never finished and it's always perforated, and the archive is never a done thing. It's always on the move and changing. So with the accumulation, I had in mind also that we have to be aware that we cannot just simply accumulate, and that this would also make our process much more opaque, much less transparent. So if we work, as you're saying now, with the Nomad Dance Academy, that you are going to basically, what we've talked about, just, because this is just now in the same kind of phases as you are, basically. We decided that basically we're going to focus on the documents from festivals. So the production of this NGOs, of organizations, and what they have done. And then you already have...
So the curation was done already.
It has been done, yeah. So how far you're going to go, whether you're going to include emails, this is then the negotiation. I've done actually very little because I was counting on the paperwork being done by my colleagues of the archive and documentation department who are taking care of the Razume, Razstave in umetniki, the database of artists and exhibitions, and they're doing the paperwork. So in the Web Museum, there are links through the artists. There are links to all the documentation of a particular artist that is related either to this work or other. So the paper archive is done in another, say, archive. So what I was also going to, that archives do different approaches to same kind of story, different kind of storytelling to same kind of material, for the reason, because one cannot cover everything. Two, we will make it opaque if we attempt to do that. And three, we cannot centralize to allow for different stories in terms of like decoloniality and decentralization of archive.
Well, for us, it is like the focus is on the works, on video works. Doesn't matter whether they are documentaries or music videos and so on, but mostly it is based on invitation or the approach of the artist to us. Then we really tried to make a kind of list, criteria. Never worked out. I don't know, it cannot be done, I would say. So there are some things that seem to be obvious or something. And sometimes we get works by one artist and we don't put everything online. Maybe sometimes we don't even think of putting some artist. But we try to, because different people collaborating, they had also different maybe vision of, yeah. So for me, it's very happy situation now that I stepped out and I can still collaborate, but I'm not responsible anymore, which is really great, I can tell you. And the focus towards experimental film seems logical nowadays. Again, we were always with colleagues, we were following the events, the exhibitions, the projects. So somehow it's small country. So it's this country that is small. And you have artists, you can approach them, you can discuss with them, as we did, because we made a lot of panels with artists themselves, how to structure the archive and so on. So we still, it's one-to-one situation, and that's how it works.
I would say, there I could pretend that I had methodology from the beginning, but I didn't really. It was connected with affinity. it was connected with the basically contemporary dance or choreographic practices. But on the other hand, because the first collection of my archive was things that I started to collect as Barbara, so it also includes, let's say, contemporary performing arts out that non-institutional production. And when you go back, of course, I many times say, now it's, for example, this field, it's called non-governmental sector or non-governmental organization, so production of NGO sector on the fields of contemporary performing arts. Before it was called, it had other names like independent, subculture, experimental, and so on. But, at a certain point you realize that you are interested for 2/3 of all the artistic production done in Slovenia, and basically I would say that you are interested in the most kind of vivid part of production of art in Slovenia, which you are surprised that no institution is prepared to cover, as and then you realize, it's a lot. So I think it's very good to confront the fact that it won't be possible to collect everything or to cover everything, and that some parts of collections are going to be connected with the people that you are more close to, because there is a huge amount of what I would call this diplomatic, the kind of diplomatic approaches to convincing people that they should donate their materials into your archive, because your position is still unstable. Of course, it's now part of the public institution, but it's anyway my private project. It's a very tricky situation, because some people are not prepared to give materials, because I'm in the Museum of Contemporary Art Metelkova, and some people are prepared to donate just because of that. It's a strange thing, and it's I would say, what I find somehow think that I have to remind myself of, that things are going to proceed, develop, and go on with my motivation if I'm not prepared to convince some other people to get involved, which is for me very crucial thing, because if I'm very honest, I wouldn't be I would like to, at a certain point, to give this space also to some other people. Or, I'm sure that there are phases that some other people are going to do with this. It's I don't know, it's marking certain kind of situation that it's going to continue, I'm sure, in completely, in some other way. So it's a kind of your own motivation. This is the most, for me, until now, this is the most kind of important thing. And I think I will finish here because
I see this dichotomy between personal involvement and institutional frame crucial. How can we achieve this institutionalization? I'm not thinking that institutionalization should happen in a museum, in a public museum or in a public gallery. Not at all. I'm seeing institutionalization still as a set of, I would not say rules, but entry points that are learning from the inception of individual, because a lot of work has been done, a lot of diplomacy was done, so it's a collective effort already. And then this institutionalization, because by making an archive, you construct history. And this is the responsibility we have to assume. For example, Kapelica has 400 or something videos in the website of Museum of Contemporary Art in Ljubljana, but in the official printed historization of art in Slovenia that issued in I don't know how many books, like when it started. Decades. Yeah, what was? 5 decades. No? In last 2 decades, that means the whole existence plus of Kapelica Gallery, then Kapelica is not mentioned once. So we are excluded from history completely. No? And it is political. Is it personal? And this is what I would like to open here. This responsibility of constructing the history, because as we know, history is constructed.
Yeah, I can pick it up. I think it's definitely a conscious political effort that we have to all put in, and it's basically your political agenda, whatever role you are playing in this, whether you are the one who's making an archive or the one who has an archive or the one who finances. And at the moment I'm quite disillusioned, but at the same time I'm hopeful. Because, as I mentioned, Web Museum, I thought that after my resignation that someone will be appointed. And I was like proposing who that might be. And that did not happen, but I'm very certain that in a due time, this will pick up and it will not get neglected because the museum is binded by the contracts to basically sustain this part of history and this like public financing that was put into it. That's for one. And this is the difference between private archive and public archive. In the public sphere, it is much easier to legally negotiate the terms under which it can be, for example, deleted. If someone would attempt to completely neglect it and delete the content, they would be subject to legal procedures. And I think it's this political and legal procedures that are quite contrasted to what we were talking about before, about this desire and personal involvement and collective and community building and what you said, the diplomacy. But this is another level of diplomacy, which is much more in terms of lobbying for your, like in what you mentioned with you establishing a lab in which artists can develop their own work here. This was a political engagement. This doesn't happen just because there is already money out there for that, you know. And there also, I would like to point out that the financing of Web Museum was in a certain way a result of this political pressure, but misplaced. Why I'm saying misplaced? Because in 2014, the Ministry of Culture decided that, yes, it is too ephemeral to have archives in the NGOs and to have it in private sector. And they said, we will make a cover centralized archive for the audiovisual repository. That was how I got the job. We were all both applying for that. And the thing is that they did not, anything that I said today, none of it they are aware of. no consideration of like the problem of centralization of archive, of appropriation of material, nothing of that. So I try to, knowing that they don't know, with Zdenka's support, we decided after they wanted to finance this project with a lot of money, just for half a year. They employed me from January 15th, 2014 to December 2014, and they thought that I'm just going to do a job. You know, like how dislocated is politics from the realistic ground. It just baffles me. But what we do then, we constantly either hack it from the back door, which we did. So Zdenka said, okay, we have to keep on supporting this, and even including you and so on. And there was like this institutional desire to support something that was not predicted by the politics and the financiers. But it is a problem that the financiers are not aware of it.
Yeah, I would say my story is a little bit different. For me, the best is to think that with all these projects that we did, and collecting material, showing material, making the archive online and so on, we are just putting a certain narrative. It's not the only one, hopefully. Because also the artists nowadays, or even for the last, 15 years, they are making their kind of archives online and narratives and so on. But then again, we have, and when I mentioned that, like you said, institutionalization, it depends, you know. We have been more institutionalized before, when there was this framework of Soros-centric and contemporary arts, which was actually budget, prescribed programs, and one of the program was comprehensive documentation. The other network, SCCA program, was Suite Media Suite, and we compound both to make video document, for example, and we are completely independent in that, because it was dependent on the local people in source centers to decide what to do. It was not prescribed, really very precise. So we could do that. We tried to make kind of coalition or network or whatever with other institutions. We approached Modern Gallery, of course. There was no museum at that time. Of course, we approached them. We got kind of signed a document by a person who was involved in that. But then the director, the same one, Zdenka, said, no, we are not collaborating in this. We want to do our own project. We still don't know what that project would be or was, because there was nothing. But they didn't want from the start to collaborate. For me, that was not a good sign. We could collaborate with all the NGOs. So we were somehow understood as a threat or something, with our own budget, you know, and our will, and also independence from the policy, cultural policy here. We even got some symbolic financial support by the Ministry of Culture at that time. Josef Scholz, one of the best. He said, yeah, I think it's a national project and we have to symbolically add, you know. And also the Ministry of Education, they bought 500 of projects, especially because there was one CD-ROM, and they tried to make professors and teachers use the equipment which they got from Open Society Institute and never used during the school to use CD-ROM. And what was at that time, we thought, yeah, okay, so video has entered the educational process. But it depends, yeah. So also in these books, for example, SCCA is also only mentioned with Urbanaria project, which was a public project, but never with this project.
So archiving and history making, yeah, I would say that archiving is for me not really, basically is preparing the condition for the possible historicizing. And I would say that my wish would be that that materials would be some kind of foundation for making different histories, not one. So basically that you provide conditions in which different narratives can be taken or done, but at the same time it is with all the responsibility, it is history making, and yes, with all the revisionism that we are facing in the region and also here in Slovenia right now, with the tendency to eliminate the past and falsify the past, I think it's a very important thing to do. Because a certain part of art production here in Slovenia throughout the history is understood falsely, or it's eliminated or erased. So this is exactly, so it's my kind of contribution, contemporary performing arts from NGO sector, but with all responsibility and awareness that this is in the Republic of Slovenia something that it's not really welcome, because if we would face structurally this kind of art production, we would realize that this is really what I said before, 2/3 of everything that is history of art in the Republic of Slovenia. Institutional part is the minority, and it's anyway for me, it's one part, it's also very important, but it's a very, I think, tricky thing to consider what, for example, our authorities now try to do, to consider it as the main and dominant force in the arts and culture.
I just want to add something else. There are two shields more. So you have on a cultural policy of Slovenia, you have the Department for Archives and then Department for Cultural Heritage. So we were the closest to that in 2005, when I wrote the letter with, it's political, it's practical, it's educational, and so on. And we got a response from the cultural policy at that time, right wing. But next year, after that, they gave us symbolic sum for cultural heritage, because we said this is immaterial cultural heritage. And it should be treated somehow not the same, like the buildings or even the photo material, because the material is deteriorating very quickly and so on. And they gave us some symbolic sum, but later they said, you are not permitted to deal with archives because you are not the archive. And then second was, you are not permitted to deal with cultural heritage because your kind of operation is not focused only on cultural heritage. So you have these two shields, political.
Actually, two obstacles.
These are territories. These are institutional territories that that basically keep a lot of time out, I would say. And to continue on this point, which I believe is crucial for talking about archiving, is and I'm now assuming the position of somebody excluded, no? As an artist or as an institution, no? In history making. So now, what we are facing in public sphere is this cynical approach, which is a question now, rhetorical, because we got some answers already from the last video, but still, you know, you are trying to build a history from something that happened before internet age. Now we are living in a radical accessibility to information. The position is totally different. So the cynical mind would say, why do you need archiving? It's everything there.
What you said before that about the history making, and what I also pointed out at the danger of accumulation, you can never make any clarity, or you can never make any sustainability with saying that everything is available in the here and now, because here and now is a fleeting moment that is, like I pointed out, it never really is, you never really grasp it. The nowness always evades you. And this is also one point why we do archives as separate institutions at all, outside, somehow exempt from this nowness that was supposed to, what I was getting at least pointed different times, at different chronological readings of some time, or different possibilities of interpretation. And it's exactly the point, because every now is going to be the past in every moment. And if no one is kind of putting aside some of the materials, what I also pointed out, and this is very, very crucial question of the correspondence that we're making now. No one is archiving emails. No one is archiving correspondences. You mentioned you archived faxes, the correspondence of the faxes, but I don't know if you're also paying attention to that in emails, because emails are so fleeting. And this is precisely the point. When you are an archivist, when you decide this bit of communication with the archive, I will store as PDF, and I will print it. And when I first found out that my colleagues at the Archive and Documentation Department are printing internet, I almost cried laughing. I said, really? Why? But it was very short-lived, my surprise, when I came to lose a document. And they said, oh, here you go. You know? So this is what I was going with the kind of really the danger of digitization. You're now talking about also for your archive about the attempt to digitize, and this is the perspective. Why are you digitizing something? Not because you want to make it accessible in the now, and the core reason for me for digitation is that I can index it in a really transparent manner. Not that I preserve it, but that I can index it so that I can access it, so that I put like ID notes on it, and then I can retrieve this ID query whenever I like. But whenever my system is obsolete and whenever I lose touch with the digital, I always have the really firm material evidence. And this is what I was going with the lecture as well. You need both the testimonial and the material evidence. I hope I answered the question.
I just wanted to say that what you propose, that with internet, why would you make an archive? Because it's all there. I mean, it's kind of logical proposal for internet, but also if you think of Slovene National Library, for example, you could say the same thing with the material things. Why would you make an archive? It's all there. I mean, and there is a certain kind of paradox with that, because it's exactly, I don't know who proposed this, that in some collections, that some collections or archives are devoted exactly for things to be lost there and unavailable. So I guess what Ida proposed is basically that you build a certain amount of doors in which you invite people to enter to the documents, but also you provide a certain kind of what would be the term? Open entrance without any doors for people to build the doors themselves, I guess. And these doors are keywords and codes, for example, a certain kind of index, but on the other hand, there is possibility to also browse or without that. But, and this is already kind of systematization, inventarization with a certain kind of instruments. But, for example, before, in the Slovene National Library, for example, in the archives of periodics, newspapers, before this digital, what is called DigiLib, so Slovene Digital Library, basically it was almost impossible to get anywhere with, I think that we are entering in the phase when materials are for the first time really available. Before that, for example, some work was just impossible. So, yeah, I guess also for the online things, it's good to have a certain kind of orientational filters, and also for the material things. It's this digitalization makes sense. Yeah.
Mentioning University and National Library, if you remember, during 2005, they were responsive, so they came when we had this kind of panel discussion about the archives. And the representative there, she was approaching us, she said, "Oh, but we also have video works." And I said, "Oh, yeah." And she said, "Yeah, we have your CD-ROM." And our CD-ROM had 21 just segment 1 minute long, because when it was made, that was all that was possible. So that was for them, that they have video. So this is one thing. And the other thing that is for us maybe also important is that Ida mentioned, like, you have raw material. Okay, also in video, you have tapes from, I don't know which time, and they keep on bringing that material. And I say, we are not the proper archive, with conditions like humid and temperature and so on. So we cannot take master tapes. But then they say, but it's even worse in my flat. So we say that we are study, research, archive, but we also have a lot of material that is maybe the only material that exists by somebody. So we also had this responsibility what to do with that. So now slowly we come to the agreement with Cinematheque, not museum. Cinematheque, who can keep this as precious for them film copies, because video for them is not so important. But we have this agreement that we make a kind of event with retrospective of one artist. So for now there were two, Miha Vipotnik and Emma Kugler, and we make the events, and then we make a kind of research, and then we put all this material that we collected to the Cinematheque. And they will take care in this respect as films, so it means they will put it on this LTO, now it's, I don't know, 7 already, and they have it in a fridge. So this is tape again, and it can last a little bit. So they will, I think, take care. But it's not that we can put all the material. We have to do it artist per artist, and when they think it's worth. So it's, but that is also responsibility, you know, especially when nowadays they want to kick us out from the space, from the building, everybody working there. So what, you know, shall I take that home or what? I can't. So that's.
So that brings me to my last question. There is an archiving of information, everything that it's fluid, and that it's archiving of the physical evidences. No, that can be sometimes fetishizing, but maybe it's nothing wrong with them, because with information right now, and these are also somehow the symptoms of two approaches. You know, one is like a total democratic, let's archive everything without any curatorial thing. And this is something that machine learning can do. You know, you just need to index things. You can fish out even emails if that would be allowed. No, everything is there. No. With deep learning, you can get the context if you want. Enough that you are setting the set of rules on which the algorithm will search, and all these predictions that are possible right now already, you will get very well represented material even. No? But on the other side, we have these physical evidences, these forensics you were talking about, no? And also what I believe is the best of what you were all saying, that you can use this as raw material for something new. So you can perform all these things and make not just showing something that happened, but you make something that never happened. No? So just maybe few reflections on your experiences with that.
I would just say in my field, contemporary dance, there is one contradiction, initial contradiction, that through the history there was a practice of covering up, or it was the practice of something, I think the less called simple repetition, basically of covering up that between original and the repetition there is a difference. There is always a difference. And I think that I don't know. I mean, you know, like if you in the ballet, for example, you have these examples that the Swan Lake is always Swan Lake. The question is whether Swan Lake, it's, you know, what do we see nowadays when we see Swan Lake or something? It used to be very different things, many example of many different things. It wasn't the same thing, and I think with every reuse of certain, let's say, materials, or I don't know, staging them, appropriating them, turning them around, or developing them. It's for example, in the field of historicization, or I don't know, archives as contemporary art, or in the field of just, it's the same as just staging and developing the materials in the process. I think, yeah, it can function, what is available there, for many different purposes, I guess. And but I would say that, yeah, there is no such thing as this absolute repetition. Yeah.
You don't need to answer if you don't want to. Yeah. Maybe in the audience, anybody has any question on that? Carol, from the perspective of the public institution, we were talking about our bottom-up initiatives. However, you are coming from a state institution. How you would reflect that what it was said so far.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting because as you were talking, I was really thinking of parallels for our institutions, which has collections, which has also to fight for its survival in a way, because depending on the political tendency at the government, we used to have 2 years ago, we had another government that was really not aware of what was the use of having scientific collections, and they even sometimes stated that well, there were so many, why shouldn't we get rid of some of them? Without saying which, why, and So it really depends on the people that you have as responsible for supporting you. That's for sure. So that's for one. The other thing is that we have a lot of donations, private donations, and the reason why we have donations, these people come to us and give us their collections, is that it's because they're going to be curated, that they're going to be accessible by to other researchers as well. And then there's this collaboration effect that is really supporting us. Belgium has a specific situation with some regions being very rich, federal state being not poorer, but not supporting sometimes as much the federal institutions. Then some institutions are supported at regional state. So we have discrepancies at our national level, but the way still between institutions we support each other, and we are now creating a research infrastructure which will enable our collections to be more supported in its digitization and be in its accessibility. But as you were saying, it's not that we're going to digitize the 38 million specimens, because this is really a lifetime and very expensive. But we decide to do this on demand, according to the demand. And this is an important and key point as well. To whom and for whom do we digitize things, specimen objects, etc. And how are we going to make them accessible? And how is this going to be reflected within our community? So with this research infrastructure, we want to have a pool where researchers will be able to check the expertise according to the collections that are in Europe, and be able to visit, or we'll be able to exchange among ourselves our expertise, our collections as well, and make them visible. So I think these three aspects are really important: government support, funding, collaboration, and be. Well, we were saying that art has a license to lie, and we need to be reliable. So this is, on the contrary, what people expect from us, to be reliable. And sometimes we collaborate with associations, and this collaboration is really a win-win situation, because the associations are glad to be with us in some projects because they have this reliability thing, and then the authorities have a look as to it that is more inclined to support. But then we are supporting or collaborating with associations, and it's a win effort for us as well, because then we are more aware of the difficulties of what they're going through, and so this is sometimes really helpful for us as well, to be on another level. I mean, yeah. So that's what I wanted to say, to share.
Any question? More? We deserve lunch. Yeah. Okay, so thank you to our speakers first. Thank you for attending this symposium. I guess this is the last part of it, so I'm concluding it officially. Those partners in the project who came for our General Assembly will have a good food for thought, I believe, because we would like to apply for continuation of this project. And I think that the perspective you gave us from your own experiences and about the importance of having a live archive for the public space is really, really important. So I believe lesson learned, and finger crossed that we'll get another shot and to continue with our efforts. Thank you.